In today's episode, we're going to go through and show you how to finish your quilt. Welcome to Watch and Learn. I'm Christina Whitney.
And I'm Kim Sandberg.
And we are in the last episode of Kim's Alaska Adventure.
Yes.
And you're going to teach us some fun things today, not just necessarily quilting. So tell us what we're going to look forward to.
Absolutely. So we get, I mean, you know what, I feel like I say this a lot when we film, but we get questions all the time about how do I trim my quilt to keep it square? How do I bind my quilt? So I thought this quilt is a perfect example to show you how to do all of those things. So I did most of this filming either in the education studio here or at home. So I hope you guys really enjoy this. This is me working in the wild.
Field trip.
Yeah, exactly. Let's go ahead and trim up my Alaska quilt. Now, I always like to trim the top edge first. This allows me to essentially start with that nice straight edge because I put the plumb line down. I have a straight edge to cut against. So we're gonna make sure I don't have any extra fabric kicking around. I'm just gonna line this up. What I like to do is try to find a marking out here in the quilt, usually a stitch line, and I'll use that to line up my ruler width. That way I am staying consistent. And then also with the line that I laid down there, my plumb line when I started stitching. Go ahead and trim that much. Just keep working my way along that top edge, all the way across. So lining up in the piecing here and then along the edge here, making sure, keeping everything nice and straight. Coming up on the corner here. Make sure everything's lined up. And trim across there. Okay, so the top edge is trimmed. Now I can use this straight edge, continue my way around the quilt and make sure everything ends up nice and square. So I'm just gonna move that quilt around a little bit. And when I do this first cut, I'm going to line up along this line here, but then I also want to line up along this edge here with one of the markings here because this is a straight line. It's a nice, perfectly straight line because I just cut it that way. That way I can make sure my corner is going to be very square. I'm going to trim this. Just keep working my way around the quilt. Now when I come down here to this bottom edge, I don't want to cut all the way through all this extra fabric that I have here at the bottom. I want to hold on to a little bit of that so I can use it to make a sleeve. So I'm going to cut down here to about the bottom of the edge of the batting there, and then I will cut across. Just cut to there. Just going to do a little cutting. So I've got plenty of extra fabric down here. On other projects, I might use this for binding. If I'm facing a quilt, I would definitely want to hang on to a big piece of fabric like this. But especially if I'm going to do a sleeve to hang from, I want to have the sleeve, if at all possible, to match the backing fabric. Okay, so once again, I'm lining this up here, and then I'm lining it up with the line inside my stitching, making sure everything's nice and straight. And you can see this corner here actually drooped a little. So I'm just trimming that off so it'll be nice and square. this piece aside over here because I am going to use that to cut my sleeve out. It's again lining up this corner the same way I've done my other ones. And with the final cut here, I'm going to do the same thing I was doing on each of the other ends. I'm going to make sure that I'm lining up straight across here with the markings with the edge of that quilt top, because I know that this edge is nice and square because it was the first cut I made. Get that lined up there. And there we go. Quilt is all nice and trimmed. Now at this point, there's a little something I want to do here. I want to remove some of these blue marks. I want to show you, this is kind of fun. Christina found these, it's like a watercolor pen, and it just has water in it. And it means I don't have to spray anything. I can just squeeze a little bit of that water down into it and put it on top of those blue marks. And because it's the water soluble, they'll just disappear. You can see that there. I'm not gonna do all of them right now, but I'll just do a few of them so you can see how great this little handy tool is that Christina discovered. I'll set that aside for a minute. Now I'm going to use this extra fabric and go ahead and cut for my sleeve. This is definitely a quilt that's going to be hung up here at Handi Quilter, put on display. So I'm just going to fold this in half and then fold it in half again so it will fit inside my ruler. And I'm not worried about this being super exact. What I'm gonna do is just line it up here on this edge at the 20, and then I like to cut an 8-inch. So from 20 to 28 here is the 8 inches. Just gonna line that up there. Cut that. And then I can go ahead and sew this. I'll show you how I do that in just a minute to create a sleeve. So now, because my quilt is trimmed, I've got my sleeve cut, and I even have my binding ready to go. I just did this in the normal way you prepare binding. I did sew it so that I've got seams that go crossways, the French double fold binding. And I am ready to head over to the sewing machine and put binding on this quilt. To create my sleeve on the back of my quilt, I'm simply folding the long strip of fabric that I saved from when I trimmed around the edges, trim the quilt, and I'm just doing a 1/4 inch seam all the way down with wrong sides together. The next step is to press. I like to center the seam along the back and just give it a good press so I get a nice crisp edge. So I can pin it on the back and then press it down flat. I have my sleeve ready to attach, and I'm going to show you a little trick here. This is what I like to do. I know it's going to be a little bit hard to see this because this is a nice busy print, but I have it folded over and pressed. What I'm going to do is lay it along the back of the quilt next to the top. So I've determined that this is the top of the quilt. And what I like to do is come in about 1 inch off of this edge. And we'll just trim some of those little things up. I'm actually going to give it a fresh cut there. And I'll go ahead and pin it in place so that the top edge of that fold is lining up with the top edge of my trimmed quilt. And then when I stitch my binding on, I'm going to stitch through all of these layers at the same time. So just putting a pin in about every, I don't know, 12 inches or so, 8 to 12 inches. Keep moving this along. Scooch this on down. And now when I get to the end here, what I want to do is just eyeball it. I'm going to fold that back, and I will just go ahead and trim that about 1 inch away from the edge there. Really precision quilting and cutting there, I know. And I'll just pop that right there. So now that edge is ready to have the binding sewn on. I'm going to sew the binding from the front, and then I'll flip it over to the back and hand stitch it down. Now I have one last thing that I'm going to put on this before I start adding my binding. I want to add my quilt label. That's what this little square here is. So this is just, I don't know, maybe like a 6-inch square of fabric. I have pressed it in half, so it makes a nice little triangle. And I just want to do this in one of the bottom corners of my quilt, so on a corner opposite of where I have my hanging sleeve. Sorry there for a minute. I swear I can't talk and do this at the same time. I'm just going to pop a few pins in here just to hold this in place, because once again I'm going to catch this with the sewing machine as I'm adding the binding, and then that way all I have to do is stitch down this edge if I want to, and I already have a label sewn onto my quilt. I'm now going to go ahead and sew my binding on. I have my binding wound onto an empty cone that I had thread that just finished quilting with this, and I just set it here by the sewing machine, just right here in the little throat space, and I'm just going to go ahead and stitch this down. Usually start about 6-8 inches down the strip, and I do have 1/4 inch foot on, and I do want to stitch to the front, so let's make sure I'm doing this the right way. I'm going to stitch to the front and work my way around. So I always have to stop and think. Stitch to the front and then flip and stitch down to the back by hand. So start a little bit down from the corner, and I do have a 1/4 inch foot on here that has a little guide on it. I like to use these when I'm putting on binding. It helps me keep everything nice and straight. So I'm just going to go ahead and stitch it down. Working on binding on my Alaska quilt, And I'm just doing the classic stitch it down. I stitch it to the front with my sewing machine, and then I have flipped it over to the back, and I'm just putting stitches in every, I don't know, maybe 1/8 of an inch or so, and just stitching this down. This is really great. I'm actually lounging on my couch at home. This is great to do when you just want to sit down and watch a movie and keep your hands busy while you're doing it. I like to use the Wonder Clips, and I only use 2. I know a lot of people like to put them all the way, but I just use a couple, and I just move them as I reach a point where I'm getting close to it again. And I just keep doing this all the way around. I am using a thread that matches my binding. That's the way I usually do that. It's a nice turquoise. It's actually Bottom Line from Superior Threads, and it's just a bobbin that I had not a whole lot left over, but it's just the amount, the right amount. And I also like to wear a thimble when I do binding. It really helps save my my fingers pushing that through. So I'll just keep working my way around. As I come to the corner, I will reduce my stitch length by a bit. I want to make sure that this stays nice and tight. And I like to stitch a little bit beyond what will be seen there. I'll take this edge off, and I like to get that nice sharp mitered point. I just fold it like that with my finger holding it there, and then I'll use the little clip to hold that miter in place. Then I'm going to place a couple of really small stitches right here, just right there at that very corner where the two meet up, to really lock it in place. Give a little bit of a tug. And I'll move this one out of the way, down a little bit. And then I do like to place just a couple of stitches right along the backside here. I don't usually do it on both sides, just to hold that miter nice and in place, at least on one side of the quilt. So I've got those in place. I'll just slide my needle back down and then keep working my way across this next section. Okay, I'm gonna turn the quilt here just a little bit. Now you'll notice this next side is where I have my sleeve. And so I'm actually gonna be stitching through a few more layers right here because I wanna make sure that this stitch goes all the way down through the binding, through the sleeve, and then into the backing. So this binding along this edge is gonna probably line up a little bit closer to the main stitching that I have here, where I stitched down my binding, just right along that edge. I'll try to keep it so that it is covering up that stitching, and I'll just go ahead and stitch all the way across. Once I get the binding stitched down, I will go ahead and go back and we'll stitch down the bottom edge of this sleeve. I'm ready to sew down the bottom side of the sleeve here. So one of the things that's important when you put a sleeve on is you want to leave a little extra room for whatever type of rod or stick or whatever that you're going to stick inside here, so that it doesn't kind of warp the top of the quilt as it's hanging. So what I like to do is I just take and roll just the top edge of the sleeve up, and then I will use the little Wonder Clips and I'll clip it so that it's up even with the edge of the binding. And this builds in a little bit of extra give inside here. Then I'm just going to go ahead and whip stitch down right along this edge all the way across. I'm usually pretty, let's call it efficient or lazy, whichever term you want to use. And I do use pretty big stitches for this. I'll start with a few little tight ones to hold it right at the corner. I'll just go ahead and whip all this down all the way across. So I'm just needing to change my thread, and I have found lately I like to use like thread wax. So I've started using So Fine. It's pretty great. It helps my thread not get so tangled. Just run that through a couple of times down the length of the thread before you start stitching. Pop a little knot in the end of the thread. I know there's I guess you could say controversy. It's always a discussion. Do you do knots? Do you not do knots? I don't know. This is the way I learned how to do it. My mom taught me this. I just always do it. So I just do a quick little knot there. I'll stitch back just a little bit. Come up and then keep stitching. It does take a few hours to do binding on a quilt this size, but honestly, I really don't mind. I always feel like it gives me an opportunity to sit and catch up on some TV shows, maybe listen to a good book, listen to some music. I think binding is also a great, oh, and I lost my clip is over here. Binding is also a great project to do if you're just sitting and visiting with somebody. So if I'm going to go visit a friend, or when I go visit my parents or my in-laws, I will often take binding with me. It's a great opportunity to keep your hands busy while you're chatting with people. So I'm coming up on the edge here, this corner that has the label in it. I've already stitched the label in, which you saw earlier in the video. I stitched it on while I was doing my stitching the binding down with the sewing machine. I find that if I don't take advantage and do it this way, often a label never quite makes it onto my quilt. I don't know if anybody else is in that same camp, but it is really easy to forget to put a label on a quilt. As I'm coming up to the edge here of the label, I have a choice. I can either keep stitching the binding down, or I can go ahead and stitch this edge down right here. I do usually like to do a few stitches, some kind of stitching along this edge to hold it down. Every once in a while I'll leave it open, maybe especially if the quilt is some kind of a gift. That way I can use this as like a little pocket to maybe stick some money in for, like, say, a graduating senior or something like that. But on this one, I definitely want to stitch this down. And there's a lot of different ways you can stitch this down. On this one, because I'm using a really contrasting thread, I'm just gonna do a little running stitch so that this thread color shows up. Just gonna go ahead and stitch this down. It's basically basting down the edge. I guess I could always get creative and actually do maybe a little bit of a more decorative stitch but this is quick. It gets the job done, and it doesn't take a lot of brain power to make sure that I am doing the stitch correctly all the way across. One thing that's kind of fun about doing it this way is, especially if it's a gift, it truly shows that you put some hand stitching into the project, because these stitches are very visible. And stitch. And once I reach this other side, I'll go ahead and fold this binding over, pop a clip in there, and then I'll go ahead and stitch the binding down going back this way. Or, you know what, actually, I just have a little bit left. I'm almost finished with my binding here. I think I'll go ahead and stitch to here, clip my thread, and then come back and finish this corner, and then yay, I will be done binding this quilt. Then the final step is going to be actually filling out the label and then laying it out and seeing if maybe I need to do a little bit of blocking. Final touch on my quilt is to fill out the label. So I'm going to call this quilt Alaskan Sunrise, because Christina called hers the Alaska quilt, so I have to do something different. And then I like to put the year and the date. So it is, I'm sorry, the month and the date and the year. I can't talk today. The month and the year. So it is April 2024, that's when I finished it. And now the quilt is finished. All right, well, you have seen it all. Clear to the finished product. It's done. And that is just a peek into how I like to finish my quilts. Now, just a reminder, the way that I do it isn't the right way. But we actually had some people write in and kind of make some comments about this. I really want everybody to know that figure out what works for you and stick with it. Yeah. This is the way that I learned how to do a lot of these different techniques initially, you know, in like 2003. And I just, you know, old dog, new tricks, not so much. Yeah. I just stick with what works for me. So
yeah. We do things differently, viewers do things differently. So this is just one way to do it.
Exactly.
So I've got a question for you.
Okay.
Now that you are done with your Alaska quilt, how do you feel?
Oh my gosh, amazing. Especially, I think back to when you came into work one day and you're like, check this out, and you're showing on social media, there's this quilt called the Alaska quilt, I have to make it. And you're gonna make it with me. And I was like, yes, let's do this.
And that was how many years ago?
I don't know, but it was a long time ago. So, but I have to say thank you for pushing me to do something like this. I've pieced a quilt that was kind of similar to this, but I quilted it with an edge to edge. So having the challenge of doing this to this extent was really great. So, and it's been so much fun. Well, I just want to give a shout out to Denise for also helping us along our Alaska quilt journey. When we decided we wanted to make this quilt, we reached out to her and said, hey, any chance you could cut some templates for us? She very kindly set us each our own individual set. So Denise was definitely part of the process, and I really appreciate her her help with the journey on this.
Yeah, and not just the templates, but the emotional support.
Oh, seriously. I feel like this quilt was, oh my gosh. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was a really fun quilt to do, but it was just kind of that project that was floating out there for the longest time trying to get us to finish it. So it feels absolutely fantastic to finish it. Just want to put a challenge out there. Anybody else that wants to take this quilt on, it is an awesome quilt.
Yeah, and a great pattern.
It's fantastic, and the pattern's well written. It's easy to follow. It is a lot of fun to quilt too, and we would really love to see how you decide to quilt yours. So be sure to use that hashtag Handi Quilter so that we'll see it.
Yeah, and I don't know if we mentioned it earlier in this video. I know we've mentioned it in others, but the pattern is from Laundry Basket Quilts. So make sure you go check that out.
Yep.
And thank you so much for joining us as we have gone through this quilting adventure. We've survived, you can survive. And again, make sure you send in pictures, hashtag Handi Quilter, and stay tuned so you can watch the videos at the end. Have fun quilting.